For over 200 years, the Golden Ball Tavern has stood on the great country road in Weston, Massachusetts, weathering changes of fortune and time. And yet it is today as alive and vibrant as ever in its past, for the house has a story to tell. It is a story of a colonial tavern, a gracious home, and the 6 generations of the family that lived in it. It is a detective story, filled with clues about the changes that were made to this house. But mostly, it is the story of the man who built it. Isaac Jones had already made a considerable fortune as a merchant and overland trader before he began to build his elegant Georgian-style home in 1765. Situated on the Boston Post Road, Weston's main thoroughfare, the house was a symbol of Isaac's wealth and of his position in the town. A grandson of one of Weston's founders, Isaac himself served as an officer in the local militia, as a selectman, and as a representative to the Massachusetts General Court. In 1768, he and his wife moved their growing family of 6 children into their new home, and by 1770 began operating a fashionable tavern at the sign of the Golden Ball. The Golden Ball Tavern was one of 4 taverns on Weston's well-traveled Post Road. Not simply a place for food and drink, 18th century taverns served as a location for travelers to exchange news, gossip, and mail. Taverns also functioned as important community centers, where militiamen met after drills, churchgoers gathered between services, and political meetings were held. Among the most popular drinks served to tavern patrons in Isaac's day were rum, beer, and cider. But the beverage that would become most significant at the Golden Ball Tavern was tea. Tea drinking was an important social custom in 18th century Britain, a custom which, along with the tea itself, was imported to the American colonies. But by 1773, more than tea was brewing in colonial Massachusetts. Many colonists rebelled against British laws that restricted American merchants from trading in tea, and the drink became a symbol of British tyranny. Yet even after American patriots issued a boycott of the once popular beverage and had brazenly dumped it into Boston Harbor, tea was still served at the sign of the Golden Ball. Isaac Jones, it seems, was a Tory. A deeply patriotic British subject, Isaac had even named his second son William Pitt Jones, after the British statesman who had championed the cause of the colonies. Living in a fairly conservative town, Isaac may have misjudged the patriotic outrage he aroused by continuing to serve tea. After being accused as a traitor in the Massachusetts Spy in 1774, Isaac issued an apology. But it was not enough to stop the uprising that came to be known as the Weston Tea Party.
As things heated up politically in the colonies, he really, I think, was ambivalent about it. He did not see himself as disloyal, but he continued to sell Dutch tea, not English tea, but Dutch tea, which he had gotten from trading in New York. But the colonists by then were using tea as a password, and any tea was totally unacceptable to them. And so they began really to come down on Isaac. In March of 1774, his house was raided by patriots dressed in painted visages looking for Isaac. But he had gone a journey to Uxbridge, so he was able to escape their wrath. But his wife was upstairs with a 3-week-old baby, and they broke down doors and stole liquor and raisins and lemons.
Even though Patriot committees urged in January 1775 that Isaac's Tavern should be closed, the Golden Ball Tavern remained open, a mark of respect for his position in the community. And yet, less than 1 month later, he entertained 2 British spies sent by General Gage in Boston, who were looking for the safest route to Worcester to capture Patriot stores of ammunition. The spies were more than pleased with their reception.
When they chanced on Isaac's Tavern, he offered them tea or coffee, and they said, and then we knew with whom we were. So his loyalties were still with the British, but he was very quiet about it. He was not making any public statements about it. And then he ends up hauling for the Patriot cause. So we know that at some point he signed the oath of allegiance in order to make that transition.
By January 1777, Isaac was working for the Revolutionary Army, hauling supplies to the French in New York. What had caused his dramatic change of heart?
He was such a principled person that I don't think it was purely the economics that made him change his mind, because he was willing to put himself at risk. But when we had a primitive portrait of his son, William Pitt Jones, restored by the Museum of Fine Arts, on the back of that portrait, pressed into it, was a cardboard that had on it a copy of a ship's bond. This would have been the bond that an overseas shipper was required to put up before he shipped any goods from Massachusetts to New York, from Massachusetts to Virginia, saying that first he would go to one of the Crown colonies or to England before he would ship back to Rhode Island or New York. And we know that Samuel Savage, who was one of the Patriot leaders here in Weston, and a group of men from Weston came to see Isaac in 1775. And what we think is that very possibly they brought this document with them, saying, look, Isaac, you may have been loyal all these years, but now you must recognize that England is really trying to enslave us economically. And the idea that this piece of circumstantial evidence would show up years later, it's intriguing, and we think that perhaps that may have been one of the causes that made him change his mind.
After the war, Isaac once again became a prominent and prosperous citizen of Weston. He continued his tavern until 1793, when the house became a private residence. In 1803, in keeping with the common practice of the day, Isaac deeded one half of his property to his oldest surviving son, William Pitt Jones. William and his family shared the house with his father until Isaac's death in 1813, and then with his widowed mother. Of William's 9 living children, 3 of his sons moved westward, and a grandson would die in the Civil War. But the house would remain in the family for 4 more generations, until the death of Ralph Frost Jones in 1963. In celebration of Weston's 250th anniversary in 1963, retired business executive Howard Gambrill, Jr. headed a committee to locate and document the town's 50 oldest houses. Upon examining Ralph Jones' 18th century home, Mr. Gambrill at once recognized its historic value. Never significantly altered since Isaac Jones' time, the original structure of the house was still intact, and many of the family's decorative changes and original furnishings had been preserved. When the elderly Ralph Jones passed away later that year, Mr. Gambrill and his wife Mary organized a group to raise an endowment and purchase the property, forming the Golden Ball Tavern Trust. Under their leadership and the guidance of expert preservationists, the daunting effort of researching, painting, scraping, and repairing the 200-year-old house was begun. As the group explored the best methods to preserve the house, they wrestled with an intriguing dilemma. Should they restore it to an 18th century appearance, or should they retain some of the equally important features of later generations?
When we took the house over in 1964, the decision was made to let the house tell its own story of change through time. This philosophy of adaptive use interpretation was unusual in that time. I think it was born of a humility that said, how can we tell what something looked like 200 years ago, and what part of the story is not worth telling? So instead, we said, we'll show the whole story of change. And it makes it a much richer social document that we have here.
As you begin your tour, you will notice many layers of change that have been preserved in place within the house. And you will discover remarkable clues that the house has revealed about its own unique story. These windows to the past give us a first-hand look at not only 200 years of changes in technology and decorative style, but also the changing needs of 6 generations of Jones family life. And now, welcome to the Golden Ball Tavern Museum, and enjoy your stay.